clock started to do its chimes, and just as the chimes were changing over into the strike, so the brass players joined in, and shortly after that the chorus as well embarked on this sort of hymn of praise, and at the great climax somebody emerged from the foot of one of the staircases, which happened to be me, playing an enormous crash on the cymbals, which I hope had the desired intention of Paddy's, which was, "That'll shake the buggers."
The chime of Gonville and Caius College, Cambridge, still celebrates the passing of the hour, just as it did when Patrick Hadley lived there from 1938 to 1962. James Gibson's just been recalling a performance of Laudamus in 1942. Hadley wrote it to commemorate the 600th anniversary of the founding of Caius. It was performed in the court of the college before everyone trooped in for a big dinner. Although it was very appropriate and musical, Hadley's use of the bell may have had something to do with its being written by Charles Wood. Now, he was an earlier professor of music at Cambridge. He was also Irish, Paddy Hadley being half Irish. Both composers are now almost wholly neglected, although their anthems still ring out joyfully in cathedral cities from time to time. Wood is remembered in Cambridge for his bell, while Hadley, in his will, left the Fellows of Caius £500 for the occasional service of wine, to be called Dr. Hadley's Exceedings. He loved good wine, as we'll hear, so the service of wine will indeed have to be occasional, and the money well invested for this tradition to last in the same way as Wood's chime. Hadley achieved his peak as a composer by the early age of 30. His masterpiece, The Trees So High, was completed in 1931. He describes it as a symphonic ballad in A minor, but it's much more. It's a symphony constructed out of a folk song. It was acclaimed when Adrian Boult conducted it in London in 1934, but has never become part of the repertoire. Vernon Handley's recording on Lyrita SRCS 105 is deleted, and Radio 3 has only broadcast this disc once. Christopher Palmer has written more than anyone on Hadley's music. He says of The Trees So High, Hadley makes a symphony the size of an oak tree out of a folk song the size of an acorn. The folk song tells the story of a pretty young lad whose life rushes through marriage and fatherhood to an early grave.
The trees they do grow high, and the leaves they do grow green. The time is gone and past, my love, that you and I have seen. It's a cold winter's night, my love, when you and I must lay alone. The bonny lad is young, but he's growing.
At the age of 16, he was a married man. At the age of 17, he was the father of a son. At the age of 18, my love, his grave, it was a growing green. And the daisies were outspread, and buttercups of gold, o'er my pretty lad so young now ceased growing.
My love is dead and buried, and in the churchyard laid. The green grass is over him, so very, very thick. Oh, once I had a sweetheart, but now I have got never a one. So fare you well, my own true love, forever.
Maybe Hadley chose this theme, the flight of life between birth and death, because he was about 30 at the time, generally a period of taking stock. Certainly inspiration and effort combined for him then, as at no other time in his life. As the folk song finally appears in full in the fourth movement, it's given a masterly setting.
All the trees they do grow high, the leaves they are so green. The day is past and gone, my love, and you and I have seen. It is cold winter's night.
Patrick Arthur Sheldon Hadley was born in Cambridge, where his father was Master of Pembroke College, on the 5th of March 1899. He was the younger of two sons. He went to King's College School, Cambridge, and Winchester College. The family home was at Heacham, near King's Lynn, in Norfolk. The house, Shallcross, was half a mile from the Wash, and it was the Hadley family home for well over 60 years. I've only found one photo of Hadley, so I asked Ursula Vaughan Williams to describe him.
He was of medium height. He had a very clearly shaped face, a good jaw, broad forehead, a great deal of charm and enormous fun, very lively mind, lots to talk about.
And an essential part of his makeup resulted from having Irish blood.
His mother very much spoiled, perhaps is the wrong word, but cosseted the two sons. They were the apple of her eye, and both sons were very close to her, and had the most she had the most influence on their general upbringing and philosophy. And Paddy used to say about the Irish that the Irish were not liars, but they were incapable of telling the truth. And then he would add, I am half Irish, and so I know.
After studying at the Royal College of Music, he went back there.
He was so brilliant that in 1925, at the end of his studies, he was appointed to the staff of the RCM. And he made the acquaintance of Delius personally, whose music had continued to influence him. And he also kept company with many people such as Balfour Gardner, Arnold Bax, Herbert Howells, Constant Lambert, a great friend particularly, Morrison, Rawsthorne, Walton and Warlock, Peter Warlock.
This set the future for Hadley as teacher, but it was a lifestyle of teaching which overshadowed his gifts as a composer and didn't leave him enough time to practice composition, his true art. Angus Morrison, the celebrated pianist and teacher, is a contemporary of Patrick Hadley. He's still senior professor of piano at the RCM. His portrait of Hadley is authentic because they'd known each other from their early 20s, and it brings out the sombre side of him as well as his musical pedigree.
He was a pupil of Vaughan Williams for composition, and as I say, we were all a group of very close friends, Constant Lambert, Gavin Gordon, Guy Warwick, a whole group of us. And he was one of my dearest and closest friends from that time onwards. He was not a tall man. I think he was a little shorter than I am. I think I'm 5'9", something like that. He had a very expressive face, and it really was a very sad face, because he was, underneath, a very sad man. He'd had these terrible experiences as a very young man. His brother, who he adored, was killed. They were only the two children. He lost a leg, which I think gave him a lot of pain. And his music had this strong streak of melancholy and sadness in it. He was a very, very sad, very, very emotional man. A lot of it was bottled up, and he was a very solitary man. He drank a lot. Well, I don't wonder, he suffered a lot, you see. I think he was in constant pain with his leg. It wasn't a compulsion, but he did drink a lot, and he was very solitary. And it got more and more a great problem in his life, I think. But underneath one knew what was a very sad man and what a very unhappy youth he'd had.
You say he was very solitary, and yet he appears to have been a very good friend to people.
Oh, he was a wonderful friend. He was very informal, and I think his friends were always welcome. But there's a deeper solitariness than just having a lot of friends. Underneath, he was a very solitary, lonely man, I think.
But he's a complex character, and much of him was very light-hearted.
During his undergraduate days, he was a bon vivant, and very much in evidence. Used to be found in the Footlights Club, though I think he wasn't a member. And he also wrote some music for the ADC, of which he was a member. There were a number of pantomimes put on each year with people like Clinton Badley and Dennis Arundel. And Paddy's contribution, there is one that's excellent, is called The Bridge of Dreams. particularly keen on what he called the just accentuation of syllables. In those days, a lot of people talked as if they were in a P.G. Wodehouse novel, and so that never said eggs and bacon, it was eggs and bee for breakfast, and it might even be brekker rather than breakfast. And J-A-S was the word that was used for just accentuation of syllables. Incidentally, they also, in those days, used to have names for people which were sometimes slightly derogatory. For instance, Delius was referred to by Hadley as Old Fred.
In the 1930s, Constant Lambert was at the centre of a formidable group of young composers. Hadley and Lambert were good friends, as the following shows. Paddy Hadley is heard here talking about Lambert in a BBC programme from the early 60s.
He was radiantly good-looking. We used to get amusing accounts of his differences of opinion with Vaughan Williams. Always very good-natured. I mean, they never had a quarrel, but they were constantly arguing over maybe quite small points. Countryside, and he was quite a walker. We would go round in the car looking at churches, and he became decidedly knowing about it. But the reason he took so immediately to the country, I think, was visual. He could see colour. Apart from going round looking at churches and walking, swimming was the thing he liked best.
They must have made quite an unusual sight walking together, Paddy with his characteristic limping gait, Lambert as well, limping as the result of childhood illness. Peter Tranchell got to know Hadley in the period when the circle surrounding Lambert was more dispersed, but Hadley's world now centred about Cambridge, and this is an area in which Peter Tranchell is expert. When I visited this present Cambridge composer in his rooms at Keys, I was more surprised than I sound to discover where I was. We are in the rooms at this moment that Patrick Hadley lived in.
Well, from his tenure of a fellowship of this college, which is about 1938, until his retirement in 1962-3.
Yeah.
And about this room, many of the appurtenances are still here. It was a room architect designed in the 30s. And some of the things you can still see. So looking around the room, you see that there is an alcove or a penthouse, and you walk through and down a step into another level. Well, now, over the entrance to that, there is a long wooden pole bearing wooden rings of a pale pine wood with a dark blue, Prussian blue curtain hanging on either side. Those are remnants. The valances and whatever you call the pelmets round the windows are part of the 30s. The grey sofa, of which one end lets down so that you can have a snooze on it if you want, that end lets down. There was a composing desk with a special writing part, and then there was a lifted section where you could put scores, and a part that went up rather like an architect's designing desk, I imagine. And we still have the 4 standard lamps. They have got different shades. The shades were of pale parchment done with a white rope, going through the top and the bottom to hold the parchment to the frame. Now, these lamps stood in particular position against the panelling, the white 18th century panelling, in their places. One day Patrick Hadley came in and he found that the bedmaker, the housekeeper, whatever you call them, we call them bedmakers, the lady what does, had moved these. And as I inherited her when I moved into these rooms, she told me the story that when Paddy saw this, he said, "You foolish woman, you have moved the lamps. You must put them back immediately." And she said, "Oh, where do they go?" And he said, "They go just where they should." And so this was a kind of word game, living a game, as Paddy spent a lot of time living a game. And so she said, "Well, you show me." And so she stood with the lamp and he stood back and gave her directions. But instead of saying a little bit this way, no, a little bit that way, and you've got it right, he said, "Middle and off, leg," and gave her directions as if he were centering her as she was a batsman at cricket. She didn't understand it at all, and it took them 20 minutes to get the lamps in their right position.
There's also something Irish about the leprechaun that sat in on the first performance of I Sing of a Maiden.
I was at the first performance. It was a ghastly fiasco because it was beautifully sung, but it was a rainy night, and outside on King's Parade a car got wet and the horn started to sound on a fixed note and just went on and on and on, and it was locked and nobody seemed to be able to stop it. And as the carol wore on, the Vice Provost, I think, or was it the senior tutor, Donald Beavis, got up and went out to see whether he could do anything and came back later, by which time somebody had managed. But I think about 8 minutes worth of that service was absolutely ruined, and it included the first performance of this very beautiful carol.
This is the most often heard piece of Hadley's music, but this depth of beauty can be found in almost everything he wrote. It merits a place in our hearts rather than a metal box in the Fitzwilliam Museum. Perhaps wisely, he left his scores to be kept in this Fort Knox of the arts world, but only praying that someone would effect their escape into the sound waves. He was certainly no elevated maestro.
Anybody could come to his rooms, and he would probably give them a drink if it was at an appropriate time, sometimes even if it weren't. He's the only person I've ever seen to decant champagne into proper champagne decanters, which are of course a different shape from the normal wine or port decanter. And on the table in his room there was a large box of about 500 Turkish cigarettes and another box of Virginia, which were specially rolled for him across the road opposite the college at a little tobacconist's, where there was a special lady who knew how to roll them according to his taste. He would say, "It's Liberty Hall, have a weed, help yourself freely." And possibly all that cigarette smoking was led to the throat cancer, of which he ultimately died. But it seemed to me from the way he made his voice that there was a kind of scratchiness about it, which might have shown that there was a propensity in the throat for some kind of trouble in any case, whether he'd smoked or not.
He liked to keep on the move. Life was a regular circuit, from college to London to country home. And of course, being Irish, he went home in the middle of the week.
He would take the Tuesday morning train to London and teach all day. He went on the breakfast train and met old hands going down and hobnobbed with them. And then he would spend the whole day in London. Then on Wednesday, or possibly Tuesday night, or whenever convenient, he went back to Heacham and spent Wednesday there, and then Thursday morning. Then he came back to Cambridge for college affairs in Thursday afternoon, and stayed the weekend. And then Monday he did most of his teaching, and Saturday morning was one of his teaching mornings. And Sunday he kept open for people to visit him, particularly with their compositions, and he might ask them to give what he called a perf on the Joe. A perf on the Joe.
Lady Fermoy is one of the friends Hadley saw most of when he was in Norfolk. When they first met in 1931, she just married the MP for King's Lynn, who was already a friend of his. She has a vivid picture of his house, Shallcross, at Heacham, and of his entertaining.
I remember one of the first dinner parties that I went to when I was a young bride was to the Hadleys, that is, Paddy Hadley and his mother, with whom he lived. His father was already dead, I think. It was a most delightful evening. I don't recall that anybody else was there. But the food was excellent, and the wine was absolutely wonderful, as it always was on every occasion when one went there, because he was a great connoisseur of good wine, and one of those people who delighted in telling you exactly what it was and what year, and everything about it. And their house was full of charm. It was a sort of rather old-world house, and a sort of medium-sized house, with a nice garden round it. Round one of his rooms, I think his study probably, there were photographs of railway engines and coaches and everything to do with railways, and those he also delighted to tell his guests what they were. He had collected them for many years. In those days it was at the end of a road, more or less, now of course very much built up, and it had a nice garden and a tennis court. I'm not sure if there was, I don't think there was much other land, but the tennis court was a very important part of life for Paddy. He loved playing tennis, he liked exercise, and then he also was a very keen swimmer, which was rather marvellous because of his leg injury, but he managed to swim very well and very energetically and loved it.
The physical makeup also had a lot to do with the composer inside and the quality of the music he created.
He was a very, very keen walker, and the fact that he had one leg which was not his own didn't seem to make any difference to the amount of things he could do in an energetic, sporting way. And I don't think he ever resented the fact, or even paid any attention to the fact that he'd been deprived.
But I remember on the occasions when he put evening dress on and so on, he was dressed as the perfect gentleman, and he often wore spats. I can't remember exactly which leg it was that he lost. I think it was his right leg. But we often used to think that this influenced the rhythm of his music, the kind of offbeat walk he had. He used to walk in a rather peculiar way because of this wooden leg he had. And very often his music would start with a kind of limp. I remember the Travellers, You Travellers on a Hard Road. It was all syncopated. And I'm quite sure that this limp he had has something to do with the rhythm of his music.
I think I have very much the feeling that he spent more time teaching and was more confident in himself as a teacher than as a composer.
I wouldn't say it was confidence. The difficulty, I think, was that he perhaps needed some stimulus to compose and could be easily put off by other factors. If, for instance, there was conviviality going, if some of his old friends turned up, then there was no composing. And I think the creative act was one of such concentration that he didn't really relish it, although he had quite a lot to say. He was very meticulous and very well briefed about the capacity of instruments and voices. And the creative process was for him a laborious effort. When he started a work, he didn't like being interrupted, and used to describe it as the diver. I don't know if you remember the Itmar. In Itmar there was a diver who used to turn up and say, "I'm going down now, sir." And that's what Paddy said, "I'm going under." And then he would surface after 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Most of his writing was done in the vacation, and he tended to go home to Heacham, where he was looked after by a housekeeper.
I think in the latter part of his life, yes, he found it very difficult to get down to compose. One had to keep on pushing him to get him down to the job. Charles Cudworth used to take Paddy in hand and bully him into getting down to composing. Now, over Fen and Flood, of course, I was there at the time when all this was being written, and Charles Cudworth often used to say to me, it's a terrible job getting him down to it, and he really did have to bully him to get this work completed at all.
He was a great friend of Paddy's, and he kept on writing texts for him, because in that way he made Paddy go on writing. And I think he got despondent about his work, as people do when it's not properly appreciated and when not much happens. He would probably have written more if he'd been more performed. It's very stimulating. When you're wanted, you produce the goods. But I think there was a streak of laziness.
I don't think Paddy was ever really necessary for him to have to make money. Now, if he'd have had the wolf at the door and facing starvation, that might have galvanized him into more action.
Musical ideas would come to him in the open spaces. I think that was where he would get his first inspiration.
I was always hearing, "Oh, I can't get it finished, and I don't know what I'm going to do, and it's got to be ready by such and such a time." And it obviously worried him very much to get a work finished, and I think it also worried him to get a work started. And unfortunately, he didn't really compose enough. I think in a way he was a very modest man about his own gifts, and he had not the slightest idea how to promote himself, and didn't wish to. And somehow there weren't the people around him who pushed him forward and put him into a light where, in my opinion, he should have been as a composer. I think he lacked the personal drive or ambition. He just loved the music, and he wrote it because he loved it.
This ecstatic music was very much part of the Hadley personality, an expression of all those bottled-up feelings which occasionally came out in other ways, as when he threatened to resign his professorship, or perhaps in even his being a joint founder of the Noise Abatement Society. But he seems an expert at dealing with life's more petty annoyances. As presenter of Keys, there was always Sunday morning chapel. Now, Paddy used to talk about being ever so delicately poised on the fence as far as Christianity was concerned. But the real reason he wouldn't take communion was probably because he found it irksome to kneel with his leg. He would sometimes go absent with notice. The notice would say that he was going to be indisposed the following Sunday, but more often it was like this.
He might have been up rather late, possibly all night, drinking port with friends, convivial friends. And in the morning he didn't want to smell of port, so he used to smother himself in Norfolk lavender water. He lived at Heacham, where there are lavender beds, lavender nurseries, and was very proud of Norfolk lavender water. The result was that everybody in chapel instantly knew on a morning when there had been a night before, because of the terrible smell of lavender water in chapel.
He did have more conventional ways of communicating, but even then added his own touches. He stayed with the Gibsons in Richmond. James Gibson had been a student, but also studying in Cambridge then, and always a much-loved friend, was his wife, Mary Gibson, who gave me a chance to see the composer's handwriting.
I believe you were one of many people who used to receive postcards from Paddy Hadley, and that you've looked out some for me tonight.
How proud you must be that your hometown is my favourite city. Seriously, though, I do think it's a superb borough, Edinburgh, don't you? Spacious yet compact, sensationally scenic, including glorious Victorian architecture. Strangely unnoisy and apparently not much plagued by traffic. Lights and zebras are necessary. None here. My room overlooks your square. By the way, George Street needs a lick of paint.
There's a feeling that he's always thinking of his friends when he's doing something else.
Well, I think that's so. If he came to stay with us, one always instantly received a bread and butter letter or a telegram even the same day. We've got another fascinating journey through North London wilds. Very, very bitumen. Nevertheless, I would not choose to live at Brondesbury.
1951 must have been an optimistic and exciting year for Hadley as co-founder with Lady Fermoy of the King's Lynn Festival. His friendship with Ursula Vaughan Williams dates from this time.
When I first got to know him, we went to stay with him at his house in Shallcross, in Hitcham, for the first King's Lynn Festival. And it was a patch of particularly nice weather, so we had dinner in the garden. And I always remember Paddy's hock, and it felt like showers of stars falling into the soup. It was so ravishing, the weather, the asteroids, I suppose, what have you, and the smell of tobacco plants and stocks and delicious food and lovely wine. And it was very exciting, and getting a new festival off the ground rather spectacularly. A great deal of work had gone into it before. And Paddy was a very, very delightful host. And one thing I remember extremely well was it being so hot. We went swimming, and Paddy, completely unself-conscious about his wooden leg, and we went down onto the shingle, and he sat on the beach, and he unstrapped it, and I helped him hop into the water, where, of course, once in the water, he was completely liberated.
Lady Fermoy would have liked The Hills and the Trees So High to have been performed at King's Lynn, but the large musical forces required were beyond the festival's financial reach. One work that was performed there in 1955 is Fen and Flood. His friend and teacher, Ralph Vaughan Williams, was at the first performance in Cambridge, and this resulted in a musical collaboration.
He dedicated it to Ralph, and Ralph said, "This is a frightfully good piece. May I orchestrate it and put in the other two voice parts, the sopranos and altos?" And so Ralph did that.
The original scoring Hadley used is well remembered by John Sanders, then taking part as one of Paddy's students, and now organist and choirmaster of Gloucester Cathedral.
That was just done with two pianos, male voice chorus, soprano soloist, a couple of clarinets, because he wanted a siren effect in the middle when the floods came up. The sirens went off, a couple of clarinets with the sirens, There might have been the odd bit of percussion. The floods, there'd just been that great flood disaster in 1953 along the Norfolk coast, and this work came 2 years afterwards, and I suppose it was very topical.
He invited the chief constable of the area which was flooded to dinner in order to get from him an actual first-hand account of what happened, and took down the very words that the chief constable said he had said over the phone.
Paddy also had a very great feeling for folk song. Now there's a lovely tune about when he's talking about Walsingham in the work. Weep, oh weep for Walsingham, for the towers high. And he sets that to this rather lovely folky kind of melody. So on. He sets when the Puritans come to the Fens, he uses a psalm tune called Lynn by a Dutchman, Pieter Hellendaal, and his harmonies, I suppose, really reflect the style of Bach, this kind of style. Then there's another lovely passage where he talks about the calm after the storm. There's been this terrific storm with flood alerts and sirens going off and so on. And then the soprano soloist sings, "The waters now are spent, all is still, an unearthly calm," and you get this very beautiful passage.
It's very immediate and very exciting and belonged to that particular moment. I don't know how it would be now, but I mean, floods do happen. That sort of a situation, it's not a once forever thing. It would have to be a live performance.
And why not at Aldborough? To quote Christopher Palmer once more, the work is rather Brittonish in conception, and had it been by Britain, it would no doubt have found a place in the repertoire of choral societies up and down the country. Such is the wealth of attractive and singable music it contains. Yet, apart from the debate, the ifs and buts and woulds and shoulds about Paddy's music, something Angus Morrison warned me of, there's the intriguing and very basic question. From where throughout his life did Hadley draw his emotional support?
He was a fair one for the women. Though he never got married, he had many entanglements from undergraduate life onwards, and frequently referred to the GF, which meant the girlfriend. When, for instance, choral exhibitioners turned up in his room with their girlfriends, and then it became time for them to go to a choir practice which was to be taken by the organ scholars and not by Paddy himself, he'd say, "You can leave her here. She'll be in good hands." And many of the young men rather feared that he was right.
I don't know whether he had any close attachments with any particular women or woman, but he always used to... used to enjoy his visits to the Evelyn nursing home in Cambridge, which he called the Evelyn Girls' School, and I think he used to enjoy teasing the nurses there, although I never had any direct evidence of this. But of course he was a lonely character too. I think to a great extent the college life did sustain him, but then of course he went off to his home at Heacham for 2 days every week.
I should think, being the generation he was perhaps held back by the feeling that he was physically maimed. He didn't let it affect him in his everyday life, but he may have felt it in his emotional life. Of this I know nothing, because I don't know what any situation exactly was. He talked very cheerfully and openly of both girls and boys, but nothing did he disclose. That again would be, I should imagine, perhaps with his male friends in a common room at night. I should have thought Angus was very much an old friend.
I think he got, in some ways, rather immature, sort of rather more like schoolboy passions, both for men and for women. I would say he was emotionally affected, so easily emotionally affected that by both sexes. But I would say he had very few active love affairs with either sex. He was rather secretive too, but I think he was very vulnerable emotionally, more than active sexually, so to speak. I think he was terribly moved by people that attracted him, but how much he wanted to impinge on their life.
And yes, I suppose having lost a leg at such a very early age, 19, he must have felt that he'd missed out on his physical youth.
I think that is very, very true, and I think that was partly the cause of this underlying melancholy that one always sensed in him. It is usually melancholics who take to drink. He was very fond of good wine, you see. He just didn't just drink anything. He had when you stayed with him, he had a wonderful cellar and would always bring up something very special if you were spending a weekend with him.
So take to drink rather than go and offload your problems on a close friend.
Yes, and a lot of the time when he was at Hitcham, where his home was, he was very much alone. He had a very devoted housekeeper who looked after him wonderfully. But I think he'd sit and listen to music that made him feel sad, and then go down and get a bottle out of the cellar.
Whose music would that be?
Delius, all the most romantic, Wagner, Delius, Ravel he adored. He adored French music, which was a great link between us, because I'm very, very fond of French music.
There was a final performance at King's Lynn that was for Lady Fermoy, also a final meeting.
The last time was when his work One Morning in Spring was performed at the King's Lynn Festival, with James Loughran conducting. And this was something that I had wanted very, very much, was to have some work of his performed in those last years. He was very ill at the time, but he came to the concert. But what was typical of him was that he didn't sit anywhere near the front. He sat rather near the back of the chapel, and really had to be dragged out of his seat to come and take his bow at the end. And that was the last time I saw him.
Were those last years fairly unhappy?
Oh, he was very ill. He suffered a great deal, and he really retired from public life in the last years of his life altogether. And he obviously was aware of the fact that he was not able to do the things that he did before.
I got the impression that being a very shy and reserved person, he didn't want people to see him in the latter state. It may have been the fact that I think he was drinking more and more heavily, And in his sober moments, I felt that he was past giving of his best to his students because of this. Also, it may have been a fear of being told to go.
Did you see much of him in those last years, the
No,
12?
very little, very little. We once went and spent, I was staying with friends not very far away from Hitcham, and we went there, I think, and had lunch with him. That's the last time I saw him. He was his wonderful, warm self, but I had a feeling he didn't want it to be too long a visit. I can't say why, just you sometimes get a feeling like that. And the closer one's friends, the more there may be things that you don't know about.
Hadley died at Hitcham on the 17th of December 1973. He was 74. He composed nothing in the last 12 years after Cambridge. When Oxford University Press, back in 1958, declined to publish his cantata, Connemara, based on his other spiritual home in Ireland, he was finally disheartened, it seems. Norfolk has responded to his memory by erecting a plaque on his house. Patrick Hadley, 1899 to 1973, composer and professor of music, University of Cambridge, lived here. Executed in 1-inch Welsh slate, I'm told. And I can just hear, although I'm not going to imitate him, I can just hear Paddy saying, "Slated at last." But let's hope this plaque brings him new friends. As for those first friends, are they going to remember Paddy in a major or a minor key?
I will end on a major note, because of his unusual personality, attractive personality, his positive view about things that he felt strongly about and had no hesitation in saying, and the real enjoyment of being with him as a person. Enjoyment had a great deal to do with the friendship that my husband and I had with him. There were always times that we looked forward to and enjoyed.
Maybe you are right, and it's time for one more of the brimming cup. But let me inform you the scenery is already swelling up. I don't care if it snows, so it hurts your arms. Lap it all up, hickory-cup, and away, away!
That'll shake the buggers.